You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 357 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich, and sadly, Tracy won't be joining us today. She actually has some work to do this weekend, so the podcast boss said she could pass on recording this weekend. But the boss said I still had to put out an episode. So, well, here you are, stuck with me. If it's any consolation, it will be a shorter episode though, since like many of you on this holiday weekend, we want to still take some time to enjoy the 4th. But anyway, what we thought we'd do with this first part of the show is to say a few words by way of review to wrap things up, I guess, with regard to what happened on July 2nd and the fierce battle for the Union left and center. Before we use the second part of this show to start to set the stage as we get ready to move the discussion along to the fighting which was still underway on the evening of July 2nd on the Union right, where the Confederates attacked Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill. So, first part of this episode, review what has already taken place on July 2nd. Second part of the show, set the stage for the heavy fighting for Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. By twilight at about 8 p.m. on July 2nd, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, except for scattered musket shots and the occasional deep-throated boom of a cannon, the intense fighting on the Federal left and center had come to an end. Long before the main combat had come to a halt, though, dozens of stretcher bearers were busy moving across the battlefield, checking bodies, assisting the wounded, and removing the men who weren't able to walk and get themselves to one of the field hospitals. Sergeant John Plummer of the 1st Minnesota recalled that before his regiments charged that evening, quote, ambulances and the ambulance men were brought up near the lines and stretchers gotten ready for use. Who of us could tell but that he would be the first to need them? And now hundreds of men joined the stretcher bearers in searching the battlefield for the dead, who were beyond all help, and the wounded, who might still benefit from timely assistance. But there were so many. The dead and maimed who fell during the long fight for the Union left and center covered the entire battlefield here, from north of the Cadore Farm, back below the gentle slope of Cemetery Ridge, up along the Emmitsburg Road, through the Peach Orchard, back to the Trossel Farm, down to Stony Hill in the wheat field, along the Plum Run Valley and Houck's Ridge, and amidst the tumbled boulders of Devil's Den, and on the shoulders of Little Round Top. That entire stretch of ground here on this part of the battlefield was nothing more than one giant, horrible scene of human carnage that all but defied description. Bodies by the thousands lay everywhere. As darkness covered the field and the sulphurous smoke of battle dissipated, the firing stopped, and an eerie quiet of a different sort descended upon the torn landscape. The moon rose an hour past sunset, casting its light on ground covered in gruesome shapes and horrid shadows. The sounds of battle were replaced with what one soldier described as a, quote, low, steady, indescribable moan. Here and there, moving about, were small circles of light cast by lanterns, held by those still searching the field for the wounded. The dead would have to wait. A soldier in the 126th New York of Willard's Brigade later admitted, quote, nothing could have been more dismal and appalling than searching over a battlefield in the dark night for a friend or comrade. To turn up one dead, cold face after another to the glimmering light of a lantern and see it marred with wounds and disfigured with blood and soil, the features perhaps convulsed by the death agony, the eyes vacant and staring. End quote. Of the 3 days of the battle, July 2nd was the bloodiest of them all. It would be a long and terrible night for the wounded, as well as those charged with caring for them. James Longstreet would later famously describe the Confederate attacks that took place on July 2nd during his big assault on the Union left as, quote, the best 3 hours fighting ever done by any troops on any battlefield, end quote. The best 3 hours fighting ever done by any troops on any battlefield. Well, that's quite a claim, and some might be inclined to argue its merits, especially those, like us, who like to point out that it was all for naught. Brave and bold the Confederate soldiers here may have been, but when all was said and done, they'd failed in that endeavor for which they'd exerted themselves and spilled their blood. To put it plainly, when all was said and done, here on the Union left and center on July 2nd, the rebels had been outfought by the officers and men of the Army of the Potomac. And ladies and gentlemen, there is no arguing the merits of that claim. It's a fact. The failure of the Confederate attacks here to break the Federals and roll up their line, as Lee hoped would happen, was a blood-stained disaster. True, Longstreet's assault effectively destroyed Dan Sickles' Third Corps as a viable fighting unit. But Robert E. Lee's ambition for the second day of the battle hadn't been to beat up an exposed and vulnerable Federal Corps. No, Lee set out on July 2nd to defeat the Army of the Potomac by rolling up its left flank and or punch through the Union line and rout the Yankee Army off the field. Lee failed in this ambitious objective for a variety of reasons, from starting off with flawed intelligence to lack of tactical coordination in what became essentially a disjointed series of brigade attacks, to an absence of reserves to exploit lodgements and potential breakthroughs. And so, when the sun set on July 2nd, after some of the most intense and horrific combat of the Civil War, Robert E. Lee and his subordinates had been outgeneraled and outfought by George Meade and the officers and men of the Army of the Potomac. And that meant the Federals here were still in position and ready to fight the following day.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast.
Wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely? That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
As you guys will no doubt recall, part of Lee's plan for July 2nd was that while Longstreet launched the main Confederate assault against the left end of the Federals' fishhook line of defense, 2nd Corps Commander Dick Ewell was to demonstrate against the other end of the Union line and to convert that demonstration into a real attack should the opportunity present itself. And so, there, on that bloody Thursday, a separate struggle was in progress, one that would grow to pose its own serious threat to the Federal position at Gettysburg. Lee's orders to Ewell called for him to start his demonstration as soon as Longstreet began his assault on the opposite end of the enemy line. But, of course, Longstreet's assault was delayed by marching and counter-marching and the troops getting into position, and so didn't kick off until late that afternoon. And so that meant that all throughout that hot summer day, Dick Ewell and his men waited, and waited, and then waited some more. For the men of Allegheny Johnson's and Jubal Early's divisions, positioned east of town, the wait was particularly grueling because for many of them there was little in the way of shade, and so the merciless July sun beat down on them hour after hour. To their fronts were Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, and while both were strong defensive positions, Culp's Hill, at the tip of the hook of the Federals' fishhook line of defense, was especially formidable since it was the steeper of the two, and its slopes were littered with boulders and covered by trees. To make matters worse for the Confederates drawn up opposite Culp's Hill, as the hours ticked by and as they waited in anticipation, they could hear the Yankees over across the way felling trees and constructing breastworks on the hilltop and essentially turning Culp's Hill into a fortress. One rebel remembered hearing the enemy troops, quote, chopping away and working like beavers, end quote. Another Confederate said that, quote, greatly did the officers and men marvel as the morning, noon, and afternoon passed in inaction, on our part, not on the enemy's, for, as we all well knew, he was plying axe and pick and shovel, fortifying a position which was already sufficiently formidable." End quote. Well, and that seems like a good point to leave things for now with starting to set the stage for this part of the action on July 2nd, as Ewell's Confederates continue to wait, expecting every moment to hear the sound of Longstreet's cannon booming off to the south. That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is in two parts, as we look back at a couple of units we talked about in the last episode. We talked about the famous charge of the 1st Minnesota, and there's actually a good book about that regiment if you're interested in checking it out. It's The Last Full Measure, The Life and Death of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers by Richard Moe. And then we also talked about the less famous charge of and redemption of Willard's New York Brigade, the Harper's Ferry Cowards. If you'd like to dig deeper into that story, you might want to pick up issues 7 and 8 of Gettysburg magazine, where you'll find parts 1 and 2 of an article by Eric Campbell titled "Remember Harper's Ferry, the Degradation, Humiliation, and Redemption of Colonel George L. Willard's Brigade." Don't forget you can find all of our book recommendations in a handy, if lengthy, list at the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Then, as we wrap up this show, we want to thank the newest members of the Strawfoot Brigade: Andrew K., Stan S., Jane H., Joanna R., and Peter H. And also a huge thank you to Paul M., Sean S., Matthew F., Dion D., and Stuart C. for their recent donations. Well, I think that's it. We made it. Thanks for sticking it through. And by the way, Tracy sat here listening as I recorded, so it was a bit weird to have an audience, even if it was just her. Anyway, thanks for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Tracy and I do hope you join us again next time when we'll continue with the story of the Battle of Gettysburg. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.